Hello and welcome to the interview on France 24. I'm Andrea Sanke in Paris. Throughout most of the 1980s, FW de Klerk stood at the heart of South Africa's apartheid policies. A minister in the staunchly conservative government of P.W. Botha, de Klerk once supported the politics of racial segregation and defied international pressure to change them. But in 1989 came a change of heart, or perhaps a change in policy. As president of South Africa, de Klerk made the decision to free Nelson Mandela, lift the ban on opposition parties, and pave the way to free and fair elections in 1994. And for those efforts, both he and Mandela were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. So, 20 years after engineering the end of apartheid, I'll be asking Frederick Willem de Klerk what he makes of today's South Africa and the struggle for good governance around the world. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's good to be here. Can I just say, before I reply to your question,
go ahead.
While most of your description of my role is correct, it's incorrect to say that during the 80s I was just at the heart of apartheid.
I said very carefully throughout the 80s, because in 1989 was when policy started to change.
From 1981 until 1989 was a period of reform, was a period of deep self-analysis, was a period where I was deeply involved in asking which way should we go. And we were going through a whole process of saying, yes, we need to have fundamental reform.
But this was when Botha was president.
Under Botha as president.
And when crackdowns became more heavy-handed than ever on dissidents.
That's true,
in South
but
Africa.
The crackdowns were because bombs were being planted. The ANC changed its strategy to say we will target civilian targets. So it was a security aspect. But while the security crackdown was taking place, the governing National Party, of which I was one of the leaders, was asking itself, where do we go? We can't go on with this. We have to change. We have to abandon apartheid. We have to embrace a new vision which can bring justice to everybody in South Africa, to all South Africans, irrespective of race or color. And within that framework, already in '86, I didn't suddenly wake up one evening and say apartheid is wrong. It was a whole process. And already in '86, we abandoned apartheid and embraced a new vision of one united South Africa, of abandoning, of scrapping all forms of discrimination, of saying we need to move to a new dispensation. When I became leader, it was my privilege to say, we have this new vision. What we must now do is to implement it. And we can only do it if we negotiate with every interested party, if we can have fully inclusive negotiations.
Okay. Your critics, however, will say, and that's why I said in your introduction that 1989 marked for the world a change of heart or a change in strategy, because your critics will say this wasn't about an epiphany you had that racism was wrong in South Africa, that apartheid was an injustice. It was because you realized the system of apartheid was simply unsustainable under international and economic pressures in South Africa.
Yes, not only for pragmatic reasons, not only because of international pressure, but from inner conviction. From inner conviction. From the early 80s, we went through this period of looking deep into our own hearts and saying, we have failed to bring justice to all South Africans. The original concept which I supported as a young man was what the whole world now supports for Israel and Palestine, was that each identifiable national group, the Zulus, the Xhosas, the Tswanas, the Vendas, and my people, the Afrikaners, should have an own state. And that all of us together should have something like the European Union, a Southern African Union, where we work together. But it failed. It failed for many reasons. We don't have time to go into them. And our challenge in the 80s was to admit that it had failed, to say to ourselves, because it had failed, where we are is not morally justifiable. We have to move away from it. And we did that. And
Okay.
it was my privilege in '89 to say, now we are going to move away from it, and we are going to negotiate a new South Africa.
New South Africa. Since you brought up the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, let me ask you this. When you hear fellow Nobel laureate Jimmy Carter, for example, parallel in a sense apartheid South Africa with Israel and the Palestinian territories today, do you find it a fair comparison of sorts?
I think comparisons are odious. I think it's dangerous. It's not a direct parallel, but there are some parallels to be drawn. Why did the old vision of so many separate states in South Africa fail? Because the whites wanted to keep too much land for themselves. Why will it fail if it fails in Israel and Palestine? Because Palestine is maybe not offered an attractive enough geographical area to say this is the country of Palestine. It failed because the majority of black South Africans didn't want political rights through that route. They wanted it in one united South Africa. And it failed because we became economically interdependent. Without being frivolous. Once you break the eggs and it becomes an omelette, you can never separate it again. And we've become, in South Africa, in the 70s and 80s, an economic omelette. We all need each other. And we realized it in the 80s. And we decided to embrace a new vision.
I'd like to ask you then about really the most recent political news in South Africa, and that is regarding the rejection of an inquiry that you and Archbishop Desmond Tutu demanded into a 1999 arms deal carried out by leading members of the ANC. You said that you are deeply troubled about the state of the rule of law, accountability, and constitutionality in our country because of the rejection of that demand. Why so?
I've started a foundation, the FW de Klerk Foundation, and its main focus is upholding the Constitution. Because that Constitution was an historic compromise. It was an agreement between fighting factions as to how we would build the future. We must uphold that. And if there are widespread suspicions, then it's not a sufficient answer to say that bring me the evidence. There are so many allegations about that only a high-profile, legitimate investigation by a judicial commission of inquiry will be able to clear the clouds away. Okay. If they find nothing, it will be the end of the suspicions. If they find something, there must be prosecution and action in terms of the rule of law. The refusal to properly investigate serious rumors and accusations about misspending of money has led to the fall down of a president and to the fall down of a would-be president. It was about government money going into financing newspapers. And it was denied, and investigations were not instituted. This can become a festering sore unless once and for all we get clarity. Were there misdemeanors, were there crimes committed in the process of the armament of South Africa, or were there not?
Are you proud of South Africa today?
Yes. I'm proud, although I see its problems, I see its challenges. I recognize the failures of the past 14 years since we became a fully operative, fully fledged democracy. But nonetheless, I'm proud. We've had economic growth over a consistent period of 14 years. There's a big amount of goodwill amongst the overwhelming majority of all South Africans. Tourism has grown, manufacturing has grown. We're no longer just a mineral producing country. and there's a will to succeed in South Africa. Yes, I believe in the future of South Africa.
What's been the biggest disappointment, however? I know you've commented before on South Africa's stance on Zimbabwe, as well as its stance on HIV/AIDS.
My biggest disappointment is the denial which existed for quite some time around the seriousness of crime and the seriousness of HIV. I must give credit to the new leadership in the ANC that at least on these two issues, they are rising to the challenge, and they are admitting the seriousness of the position, and they have committed themselves to really do something meaningful about it. I hope it will succeed.
Also, Nelson Mandela, whom you accepted the Nobel Peace Prize with back in 1993, just had his 90th birthday. How do you feel about him today?
We're
two
friends.
had your differences in the past.
We have a very good relationship. We have had our ups and downs. At times, things were quite tense between us. We were political opponents. Some of our supporters on both sides were acting against our own orders, continuing with underground violence, and this caused a lot of conflict and tension between me and him. But we've put that behind us. We're friends. I really admire the man. And he was at my 70th birthday, and he made a speech which made me blush, recognizing also my contribution. So I hope Madiba will be spared for a long time. South Africa needs his moral authority.
Okay, FW de Klerk, very unfortunately, we are completely out of time for this edition of the interview. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Goodbye.